The sheriff was wounded in a shootout, but when the Apache girl treated him, she saw his tattoo and learned the truth that changed her life forever. Want to know what happened next? Then subscribe to the channel, like the video, and write in the comments where you are watching us from. The dust of the frontier road shimmered beneath the relentless sun, and for a time the only sound was the steady rhythm of horses' hooves pulling the mail coach eastward toward the next station. The passengers inside fanned themselves with handkerchiefs, uneasy, as though they too could sense what lay waiting ahead. Out on the horizon, a handful of riders appeared like shadows cutting across the land. Their approach was swift and silent until the distance between them closed, and the echoes of hooves thundered through the canyon walls. The driver cursed under his breath, snapping the reins harder, but already the bandits were upon them, their rifles raised and voices carrying sharp commands. Sheriff Samuel Harper had followed rumors of this gang for weeks. They had robbed traders, burned out homesteads, and left bodies in shallow graves where no lawman had been near enough to intervene. But today their arrogance had drawn them close enough to the town he had sworn to protect. He had ridden out at dawn, following the winding trail along the creek bed, and now found himself positioned just beyond the road where the ambush unfolded. As the first shot cracked through the air, his hand went to his revolver, and he spurred his horse forward with grim determination. The scene erupted into chaos. The coach driver fought to keep control of the panicked horses, while the passengers screamed and ducked for cover. Samuel fired, his shot dropping one of the raiders from his saddle. Dust swirled in a choking cloud, mingling with the acrid scent of gunpowder. The bandits scattered, some turning their rifles on the sheriff as he charged. Bullets hissed past him, snapping chips of stone from the rocks nearby. He returned fire with practiced precision, each shot buying the coach precious moments to flee. But in the storm of gunfire, he felt the searing bite of pain tear through his side. He reeled, gripping the saddle horn, fighting the darkness creeping at the edges of his vision. Another round caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him in the saddle before he tumbled to the hard-packed earth. The world tilted, filled with the thunder of hooves, the cruel laughter of bandits, and the cries of frightened horses. For a moment he thought the gang might finish him, but the chaos of the fleeing coach distracted them. Someone shouted for retreat, and within moments the riders melted back into the wilderness. Samuel lay motionless, the taste of blood sharp on his tongue, the dust settling heavy across his body. Time passed strangely as he drifted in and out of awareness. The sun dipped lower, shadows lengthening, while circling buzzards began their slow, patient dance overhead. His breath grew shallow, each inhalation a struggle. He wondered fleetingly if this lonely stretch of land would be his grave, if his name would fade as quickly as the blood soaking into the sand. Yet fate had other designs. From the rocks above the road came the sound of footsteps, light and cautious. Figures emerged, their silhouettes outlined against the fading sky. They were Apache hunters, their movements fluid and alert, eyes scanning the horizon before resting on the battered lawman sprawled in the dirt. One knelt, pressing a hand gently against his chest to feel the faint rhythm of life still there. A brief exchange in their own tongue passed between them, low and certain. Then they lifted him with deliberate care, supporting his weight across their shoulders. They moved swiftly, carrying him away from the blood-stained road and deeper into the sheltering wilderness where the land rolled into canyons and hidden streams. Night had fallen by the time they reached the camp. Fires burned low, sending spirals of smoke into the cool desert air. Women and children glanced up with wary eyes as the hunters entered, bearing the wounded stranger. Some voices rose in protest, sharp and fearful, but the authority of the eldest hunter silenced them. The lawman was laid in a lodge where the smell of herbs and smoke mingled, and there, stepping forward with steady hands, was Naya, granddaughter of the aging chief. She was young but carried herself with the quiet strength of one who had grown in the heart of hardship. She knelt beside the unconscious sheriff, her eyes tracing the pallor of his skin, the torn fabric darkened with blood. Her hands moved with practiced grace as she gathered bowls of water, strips of cloth, and bundles of medicinal plants that had been passed down through generations of healers. By the flickering light, she cleansed the wounds, whispering under her breath as though calling upon the spirits of her ancestors. The sheriff stirred faintly, groaning, his breath ragged, but she pressed her palm gently against his chest, urging him toward stillness. Through long hours of the night she worked, brewing bitter infusions of willow bark and sage, crushing roots to press against torn flesh, binding him with strips of cloth softened by smoke. The camp around her drifted into sleep, but she remained awake, watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Outside, coyotes howled against the stars, and the wind carried with it the scent of pine from the higher ridges. It was during one of these moments, as she lifted his arm to change a bandage, that her gaze froze. The flickering firelight revealed something unexpected etched into his skin. Just above the bend of his forearm, half hidden beneath dried blood and dirt, was a tattoo. The design was unmistakable to her eyes, curved lines and strokes forming a protective symbol known among her people. A mark not worn lightly and certainly not belonging to outsiders. Her breath caught as recognition pierced through her. Memories of her childhood stirred. She remembered sitting at her grandfather's knee as he spoke of days long past. He would trace that same mark on his own arm, explaining its meaning as a shield and bond, a reminder of an oath fulfilled. He had told her of a night when raiders had taken a woman, a settler, and how he had led his warriors against them. He had freed her, carrying her from fire and danger, and before they parted, he had pressed this mark upon her arm as a promise that his people had stood against violence, not for it. It was a tale often spoken in hushed tones, a story of compassion hidden within the years of conflict. Naya's eyes moved from the sheriff's pale face to the tattoo, realization tightening in her chest. The man lying before her was no stranger to that tale. Somehow, across the years, the mark of her grandfather had found its way to him. It was impossible and yet undeniable. She felt a mixture of unease and fate, as though the past itself had risen through the dust to stand before her in living form. The night wore on. She finished her work, binding his wounds more firmly, but her thoughts remained tangled around the sight of that tattoo. Outside, the campfire smoldered low, and dawn crept slowly across the horizon, painting the sky with pale streaks of gold. Samuel Harper breathed easier now, the fever breaking slightly under her care. Still unconscious, he turned restlessly, unaware of the thread of history that had tightened around him. Naya sat back on her heels, exhausted but watchful. She understood in her heart that his survival meant more than the saving of one man. It was a sign that the actions of her grandfather, once told like distant legend, were not finished with time. They had left a legacy that now stretched across bloodlines, across enemies turned reluctant allies. The lawman of the white town bore the mark of an Apache savior, and through it, the two worlds stood poised once more to collide. As the sun lifted fully above the ridges and bathed the camp in light, Samuel Harper stirred, his breath deepening, his eyes fluttering as life returned. The day ahead would draw him further into this unexpected bond. For now, the beginning of the story had been written, not in words, but in scars, blood, and ink pressed into flesh. And in the eyes of Naya, the wounded sheriff was no longer only a stranger brought in from the desert, but the living proof that the past had not been buried, only waiting for its moment to be remembered. The morning light filtered softly through the hides that formed the lodge, casting faint golden patterns across the worn floor. Samuel Harper opened his eyes with effort, the brightness stinging, his body heavy as if weighed down by stone. At first, confusion clouded his thoughts. He remembered the raid, the gunfire, the sudden, searing pain, and then the taste of dust as he fell. Everything after that was fractured, blurred images of faces leaning over him, hands pressing against his wounds, and a woman's steady presence that hovered near even in the fevered haze of half-dreams. Now as his gaze adjusted to the light, he saw her sitting nearby, her dark hair falling over her shoulder, her eyes watchful but calm. He realized with a start that he was alive, though every breath reminded him of how close death had been. Naya rose without a word and moved to check the bandages she had tied hours earlier. The sharp scent of herbs clung to the air around him, mingling with the smoke of a small fire smoldering just outside. Her hands, careful and precise, lifted the cloth from his side to inspect the wound. Samuel flinched, teeth clenched, but she steadied him with a firmness that betrayed long practice. Her expression gave nothing away, but there was no mistaking the resolve in her movements. She had chosen to keep him alive, though she owed him nothing, though he was a man from the very world that had long sought to erase her people. He watched her in silence, his mind turning inward. In the stillness, he felt old memories pressing forward, memories of his mother's voice telling stories at night when the house creaked under the prairie winds. She had spoken often of the dangers of the frontier, of men who took what they wanted with violence, but also of a night when salvation had come from an unexpected place. Her voice had carried a reverence he had not understood as a boy. She told of being cornered by bandits, her life nearly extinguished, when warriors from the Apache nation had intervened. At their head was a man whose presence she never forgot. She described the way he had carried her from the flames of her captor's camp, setting her down gently as though she were kin. He bore upon his arm a mark, an emblem she insisted was more than decoration. She had spoken of it as a gift, a reminder etched into her own flesh before they parted, that she might always remember who had stood between her and death. Samuel remembered the first time he saw that mark, traced faintly into his mother's skin. She had called it a shield, a promise. When he was older, he had chosen to have the same design inked into his own arm, a way of honoring her story, of carrying it forward when she could no longer. He had never spoken of it openly. Few would understand, and fewer still would respect it. To the townsfolk, the Apaches were enemies, their presence a shadow cast over the frontier. Yet to him, the mark was a reminder that the world was not as simple as they claimed. As his thoughts tangled in the past, Naya finished binding his side and adjusted the blankets. He caught sight again of her eyes falling briefly upon his arm, and he knew she had seen the tattoo. A quiet tension lingered between them. Though she said nothing, the weight of recognition was clear in her stillness. It unsettled him, though not in fear, but in the strange awareness that she knew more of his story than most who had lived beside him for years. The days passed slowly in the rhythm of healing. Samuel grew stronger, each morning able to sit longer, to eat more than the broth she placed before him. He tested the strength in his hand by drawing the shape of his revolver from an empty holster left near his cot, the familiar movement grounding him in who he was. Yet each time he shifted, the ache in his side reminded him that his fight with the gang had left more than surface wounds. He owed his survival to the care of the woman who watched him with guarded eyes and spoke sparingly. Her words carried more by gesture than by sound. At night, when the camp lay quiet under the stars, Samuel would listen to the faint crackle of the fire outside and recall the tone of his mother's voice. He could hear her caution and her faith interwoven, warning him of the dangers of men, and yet holding up the image of the Apache who had risked everything to save her. Now he began to understand in ways he had not before. For across from him each night sat the granddaughter of that very man, tending to a wounded lawman who by every measure of their divided world should have been left to die. For Naya, the days of his recovery were heavy with memory as well. She had grown up on stories of her grandfather, a leader both fierce and merciful, whose choices had defined the path of their people. The tale of the white woman he had saved was one she had heard whispered around the fire, half admired, half questioned, by those who felt no good could come from kindness to outsiders. Yet her grandfather had insisted on teaching her that compassion was not weakness. The mark he bore, the same mark she now saw etched into the sheriff's skin, was proof of a promise kept. Seeing it on a white man was at once unsettling and affirming. It was evidence that her grandfather's choice had not faded into nothingness, but had crossed into another life, another generation. As Samuel's strength returned, talk of the outside world began to creep back into his thoughts. Though his body still ached, his duty as sheriff called to him. He thought of his town, its people, and the fear that had already begun to spread after the latest raid. He knew the gang that had left him for dead would strike again. They would not be satisfied with a single ambush, not when they had tasted the ease of violence without consequence. The thought of lying idle in a lodge while his people suffered gnawed at him. Naya saw the restlessness in his eyes before he spoke of it. She had been raised to read the quiet language of expression, the tightening of a jaw, the way a man's gaze wandered beyond the walls of his bed. She understood he would not remain among her people longer than necessary. She also understood that the fate of her own kin was bound to the violence of the bandits as well. If the gang grew bold enough to burn a town, It was only a matter of time before they turned their guns toward the scattered camps of the Apache. She thought often of her grandfather's teaching, of the choice he had made to save rather than destroy, and she felt the weight of continuing that legacy. The sheriff began to test his body in earnest, standing longer, walking further beyond the lodge. The first time he tried to saddle a horse again, his legs nearly buckled, but he clenched his teeth and forced himself onward. The hunters watched him with cautious respect, muttering among themselves but not interfering. By the second week, Samuel could draw and holster his revolver without grimacing, though the wound in his side tugged painfully with every breath. He was not fully healed, but he was determined to return. When word came from passing traders that the bandits had struck another settlement to the north, leaving behind smoke and grief, Samuel's decision hardened. He would ride back, rally the townsfolk, and face the threat. Yet as he prepared, he felt the lingering gaze of Naya upon him. She stood near the edge of the camp, her arms crossed, her expression thoughtful. He realized with certainty that she would not let him face it alone. There was something unspoken between them, forged in the silence of long nights and the shared recognition of that mark. For her, the choice was already made. If her grandfather had once saved his mother, then she would stand beside the son who now bore his mark. It was not simply repayment of a debt, it was continuation of a bond born in blood and fire. She knew that walking beside a white lawman into his town might invite suspicion, even hatred, but she also knew that her place was there. The old stories were alive once more, demanding to be carried forward into a new chapter. As the morning of his departure came, Samuel saddled his horse with deliberate care, every motion steady though his body protested. Naya readied her own belongings with the ease of one accustomed to travel. Neither spoke of the choice, for there was no need. It was written in the weight of their silence, in the mark upon his arm, in the memory of a promise made long before either of them had been born. The sun rose over the horizon, casting long shadows across the camp. The two riders guided their horses side by side out of the circle of lodges, the eyes of the Apache watching from the doorways, uncertain but respectful. Behind them, the camp returned to its rhythms, but before them stretched the long road back to the town that waited in fear. The sheriff rode with the ache of healing wounds and the steady knowledge that the days ahead would demand all his strength. Naya rode with the conviction that she carried her grandfather's spirit beside her, his choice now alive in her own. Together they left the quiet of the camp and turned toward the world beyond, where the shadow of the past would meet the trials of the present. The bond between them was no longer hidden in scars or whispered tales. It was alive, forged anew in the silence of the desert morning, ready to be tested in the fire that waited just beyond the horizon. The journey back to town was not hurried, for Samuel Harper's body could not yet endure the punishing pace of hard riding. Each jolt in the saddle sent a dull ache radiating through his ribs, and his arm throbbed whenever he gripped the reins too tightly. Yet he pressed forward with quiet resolve, the bandage beneath his shirt dampened by sweat and determination. At his side, Naya rode with the stillness of one accustomed to long distances, her posture erect, her gaze sweeping the horizon. They spoke little, but there was a rhythm between them, an understanding carried not in words but in the steady cadence of hooves striking the earth. The silence itself seemed to form the bridge between their worlds, fragile but firm enough to carry them across the gulf of history and suspicion. By the time they neared the outskirts of town, the sun had begun its slow descent, staining the sky in shades of orange and red. The settlement lay quiet beneath its veil of dust, the streets emptier than Samuel had ever known them. Where once children had played near the troughs and men had leaned in conversation outside the saloon, now shutters were drawn and lamps burned dim behind closed curtains. The people of the town had withdrawn into themselves, gripped by the same fear that had haunted their nights since the last raid. Samuel felt the weight of their absence pressing upon him, the realization that his duty had never been heavier than in this moment. As they rode in, faces peered from windows and doorways, eyes wide at the sight of their sheriff alive. Yet those same eyes narrowed when they fell upon Naya. The murmurs carried across the street like wind through dry grass, hushed but unmistakable. Some drew back entirely, shutting their doors against her presence. Samuel dismounted with a grimace, the effort of swinging down from the saddle, reopening the ache in his side. He stood tall despite the pain, placing himself deliberately between the woman who had saved his life and the suspicion of the townsfolk. Word spread quickly. Before long, a cluster of men gathered near the general store, their expressions caught between relief at seeing their sheriff and unease at the company he kept. Samuel addressed them with measured authority, reminding them of the oath he had sworn and the violence that still loomed on their borders. He did not disguise his wounds nor his reliance on Naya. Instead, he spoke plainly of the gang's growing boldness, of their strikes against settlements and travelers alike. The town could no longer afford to hide behind locked doors. They would come again, and this time, they must be ready. At first, there was resistance. Fear had settled too deep, and the presence of an Apache woman made their doubts sharper. But Samuel's words carried the weight of truth, and the sight of him battered yet unbroken stirred something in those who had once looked to him for guidance. When Naya stepped forward, laying out with calm certainty the tactics she knew from her people, the silence deepened. She spoke not as a stranger, but as one who had faced the wilderness and survived it, who understood the ways of ambush and defense. She showed them how to use the land itself as an ally, to turn alleys and rooftops into traps, to lay obstacles that would slow mounted raiders. Though suspicion lingered, some began to listen. A rancher offered his barn as a storage place for weapons and supplies. The blacksmith promised to mend the iron hinges needed for barricades. Slowly, like embers coaxed into flame, the will to resist began to rise again among the townsfolk. Samuel watched it unfold with a mixture of pride and humility. He knew they would not have listened to him alone. It was Naya's voice, steady and sure, that had given shape to their fear and turned it into resolve. In the days that followed, preparations consumed the town. Samuel oversaw patrols, moving slowly through the streets, his body still mending, but his authority unquestioned. Naya moved among the people, teaching them how to listen for the silence that precedes danger, how to set signals with lanterns and mirrors, how to station lookouts where eyes could see farthest across the plain. At first, many kept their distance from her, but when she helped a young boy repair his sling for carrying stones, or showed a widow how to lash a barricade across her doorway, their suspicion gave way to reluctant respect. She did not ask for trust, but earned it in small, steady gestures that none could ignore. At night, Samuel sat by the lamplight in his office. Maps spread before him, marking the routes the bandits favored. He traced with weary fingers the path where he had fallen, the place where his life had nearly ended, and thought of how fate had twisted since that day. His thoughts returned often to the tattoo on his arm, to the story carried in ink and memory. He understood now that the mark was not merely his mother's legacy, but a bond that reached forward into the present, binding him to the woman who now shared his cause. Naya, for her part, spent those evenings in quiet reflection. She thought of her grandfather's words, of the night he had saved a woman from death, and how that act had rippled outward into years he would never see. Now she stood in the heart of a town that had once feared her people, shaping its defense with knowledge carried through her bloodline. She did not take pride in the irony, but in the fulfillment of something larger, a circle unbroken. The mark on the sheriff's arm was proof that her grandfather's choice had not been in vain. When the first signs of the gang's return reached them, there was no panic this time. A rider had spotted smoke on the horizon, the faint trace of scouts testing the edges of the land. Samuel ordered the townsfolk into position. Naya moved swiftly among them, adjusting placements, reminding them to stay calm, to remember their training. The town that had once been silent and fearful now hummed with a tense readiness. The barricades stood firm, rifles were loaded, and lanterns flickered in coded signals along the rooftops. As twilight deepened, Samuel stood in the center of the street, his badge catching the last glint of fading sun. He felt the weight of his revolver at his side, the ache of his wounds, and the steady presence of Naya nearby. For the first time in many days, he felt something beyond pain and duty. He felt hope, not for himself alone, but for the people who had gathered around him, for the woman who had crossed the gulf of suspicion to stand at his side, and for the possibility that the bond forged in his mother's past might yet save his future. The night was quiet, too quiet, the kind that made every sound sharper, every shadow deeper. The people of the town held their breath, waiting for the storm to break. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its cry cutting through the stillness like a warning. Samuel's hand rested on the grip of his revolver, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the edge of the street. He knew they were coming, and when they did, the town would be ready. He looked once at Naya, and she met his gaze with steady certainty. Whatever the night would bring, they would face it together. And so the town, once gripped by fear, stood now on the edge of battle, not as scattered souls hiding behind locked doors, but as a community forged into defiance. The gang that had left the sheriff bleeding in the dust would find a different welcome this time. A welcome shaped by the unlikely bond between a wounded lawman and the granddaughter of the man who had saved his mother's life. As the first stars emerged above the desert sky, the stage was set. The test of their resolve was near, and the alliance born of past and present stood ready to meet it. The night lay heavy over the town, pressing its silence into every corner, until even the creak of wood seemed louder than it should. Men and women crouched behind barricades, their knuckles white against the wood of rifles, and the handles of tools turned into weapons. Lanterns burned low in windows, their faint light barely enough to mark where homes stood. The air was tight with anticipation, and every heartbeat seemed to echo in the stillness. Samuel Harper stood in the street, shoulders squared despite the ache in his wounds, his eyes fixed on the horizon beyond the edge of town. Beside him, Naya stood calm and unyielding, her bow strung and quiver at her back, her presence steadying those who looked on her with a mixture of awe and quiet gratitude. The first sound came like a ripple through the silence, the faint rhythm of hooves carried on the dry air. Then more followed, a rolling thunder that grew louder with every passing second. Dark shapes emerged at the far end of the street, riders fanning out in the gloom, the bandits returning with the confidence of wolves circling sheep. But this time, the town was not cowering. This time, it stood waiting, teeth bared and eyes unflinching. The leader of the gang spurred his horse forward, calling for his men to break the defenses, to take what they wished. His voice was swallowed by the crack of the first rifle fired from a rooftop. The bullet struck sparks from the iron of a saddle, startling the raider's mount and sending the man sprawling into the dust. The battle began in earnest. The street erupted with gunfire, flashes of light cutting through the darkness as townsfolk fired from behind overturned wagons and barricades of barrels and planks. The gang pressed forward, shouting curses, their shots tearing splinters from wood and shattering glass. Horses screamed as the chaos grew, hooves pounding against the packed earth. Samuel fired with the calm precision of long practice, his revolver an extension of his will, each shot measured, never wasted. His wounds throbbed with the strain, but he refused to falter, his figure visible at the center of the fight, a rallying point for all who saw him. Naya moved with silent swiftness, loosing arrows that found their marks with deadly accuracy. She guided townsfolk when their panic threatened to overwhelm them, her sharp eyes catching weaknesses in the line before they broke. Once, when a raider burst through a gap and charged toward a cluster of frightened women, she struck him down before he reached them, her bowstring humming like a song of vengeance. Though the people had doubted her, in that moment their fear of her heritage gave way to the undeniable truth of her courage. The clash surged back and forth, neither side yielding easily. The gang was fierce, hardened by years of bloodshed, but the town had been remade in its fear, its people welded into resolve by the leadership of their sheriff and the knowledge that their survival depended on unity. The barricades, built with desperate hands and guided by Naya's wisdom, held firm against the charge of horses. Oil lamps had been placed in narrow alleys, their flames casting deceptive shadows that confused the raiders as they tried to maneuver through the twisting paths. At one point, a group of bandits tried to circle around through the livery stable, but a trap laid earlier with ropes and boards brought them crashing down, their mounts tumbling in a heap of dust and broken timber. The fighting raged into the heart of the night. Samuel felt his strength waning, his vision swimming from blood loss, but he would not retreat. Each time his hand shook, the memory of his mother's voice steadied him. He thought of the mark on his arm, of the choice made long before he was born, of the lives bound together by that single act of courage. It carried him through when his body alone could not. Then came the moment that decided it all. The leader of the gang, a man scarred by old battles, pushed through the chaos and fixed his gaze on Samuel. He raised his rifle and fired, the bullet grazing the sheriff's arm and spinning him back a step. The townsfolk cried out, fear trembling in their voices. But before the outlaw could fire again, Naya was there. She loosed an arrow that struck his weapon, knocking it from his grip. In the heartbeat that followed, Samuel raised his revolver, his aim steady despite the pain, and fired a single shot that struck the man squarely in the chest. The leader fell, dust rising around his body, and a hush fell over the street. The bandits wavered. With their leader gone and their ranks scattered, panic rippled through them. Some spurred their horses and fled into the night, the thunder of retreating hooves carrying their defeat into the distance. Others threw down their weapons and surrendered, too broken to fight on. The townsfolk stood, hearts pounding, realizing the danger had passed. A ragged cheer rose, tentative at first but growing into a roar of relief and triumph. The town had endured, and it was still standing. Samuel lowered his revolver slowly, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The ache of his wounds roared now that the battle was done, but his spirit burned with the fierce satisfaction of victory. He turned his gaze toward Naya, who stood amid the fading chaos, her bow still in hand, her face calm, but her eyes alight with something deeper than triumph. She met his gaze, and in that silence between them, more was said than any words could capture. As dawn crept over the ridges, painting the sky in pale gold, the town gathered in the street, weary but unbroken. They looked to their sheriff and to the woman who had fought beside him, no longer as an outsider, but as one who had saved their lives. Gratitude replaced suspicion in their eyes, though unspoken, and the weight of change settled quietly over them. The bond between Samuel and Naya, born of blood and memory, had written itself into the story of the town. Later, when the bodies had been buried and the barricades dismantled, Samuel walked the length of the street alone, his boots stirring the dust, his mind heavy with reflection. He paused at the edge of town where the land stretched open, the horizon vast and unending. He thought of his mother, of the night she had been saved, of the mark she had carried, and of the choice that had shaped everything since. He thought of Naya's grandfather, a man he had never known, whose courage had reached across decades to touch this moment. He raised his sleeve and looked once more at the tattoo on his arm, its lines dark against his skin, and for the first time he understood fully that it was not only a reminder. It was a bond, a legacy, and a promise that he now carried forward. Naya stood beside him then, her presence quiet but steady. She too thought of her grandfather, of how his act of mercy had been doubted by some of his people, yet had borne fruit in ways he could never have foreseen. She knew that his spirit lived on, not only in her blood, but in the unity forged this night. She glanced at Samuel, the lines of weariness on his face, the stubborn set of his shoulders, and felt a certainty settle within her. The legacy of salvation did not belong to one people alone. It was shared, written across families, towns, and generations. As the sun rose higher, warming the land and washing away the shadows of the night, the town stirred to life again. Children emerged from their homes. Men returned to their shops, and women carried water to sweep the dust from their doorways. The world was not remade in a single night, but it had been changed. Fear had loosened its hold, and the seeds of respect had been planted where suspicion once grew. For Samuel Harper and Naya, the road ahead remained uncertain. There would be more trials, more divisions to face, more dangers in the unforgiving land. But they carried within them the strength of a story larger than themselves, a story of courage passed from grandfather to granddaughter, from mother to son, from one generation to the next. And as they stood side by side beneath the morning sun, they knew the story was not ending. It was only beginning again. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Explore our channel for more stories like this, and check out the recommended videos waiting for you right after this. And don't forget to share this video with your friends so they can enjoy it too.